Good morning, afternoon, or evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's episode 67 of the Big Boys Table, and we're going to be talking about pacing with purpose. And I got Mesk, who does not start with P. So I didn't have a third P there, but I guess I am the P.
Mr. P.
Yeah, so what's going on, dude? How are you? What's happening? Except I already know the answers to these questions because we were just talking about it. So you've been continuing to have days. Like the last episode, if you remember, you were like, today's been a day or something, and then I guess the days have continued to happen. So yeah, it's interesting stuff going on in the background, even when you were playing Fraudarchy with us just yesterday. So
yeah,
all the insanity continues as usual.
Yeah, during Fraudarchy, I've got a lot of people running around in the background because we basically, since we're both me and my grandmother are completely incapacitated pretty much, we've been having her relatives come over and they've been helping out quite a bit. One of our daughters especially helped out a fair bit, stepped up when the whole hospital shenanigans went down. So two of her daughters came over and were helping. They've been coming over every couple weekends to try to help with some of the packing and sorting and then getting rid of stuff. So I got rid of like the 2 cat cages and some other such things. And lots of furniture has to be gotten rid of. Now, most of the stuff, when we sell it, we get maybe like $10 for it, and that's about how much is worth.
I was going to say, so usually reselling shit like that is you get a fraction of the value, right?
Yeah. What the value is to get it out of the house because we're actually incapable of moving it. So, just like absolute chaos left and right. And then, just everything else going on. So it is March 12th, and we have to be out at the end of April, and we have nowhere to go still.
Oh, it's the end of April. Okay. I was actually thinking it was the beginning, like April 1st.
Yeah. So the landlord, I do have a story for you. So
let's go.
One of the tenancy laws here is that when you are given a notice to leave, you get a month. The last month, you can either get it free or the landlord has to reimburse you after it. Usually you just take the free month because, well, when it costs thousands of dollars just to hire movers to move a few pieces of furniture, you really need the money. Also, most landlords will keep the safety deposit to line their pockets. Classic. So that's something else you got to watch out for it too. And when my grandmother had to, because the landlord before was like, if you need April, then just let us know. And then she phoned and it's like, yeah, so we need April. Also, don't forget that the last month is free. And they quickly scheduled an emergency visit to come here and set us right. But I think what happened between then and them actually arriving is they actually did research and they were like, oh, wait, we can't do fuck all. So the meeting was pointless. But they were like, yeah, we thought you were going to be out at the beginning of April. We scheduled renovators to come over in the middle of April and do all this work. And nobody can be here. And like common sense, bro. We had this conversation like twice over already. Just fucking use your head. God damn. So
maybe the renovators will fix many of the problems while you're living there, and then you get
like it would have been nice because I don't think they're gonna fix it. I think they're just gonna prate it up and re-rent it. Right. If I had an automobile, I would come down here in a couple months and check up. And if it's somebody renting, I can take them to court and get a year's worth of rents off of them, actually. So,
oh, really? Interesting.
Because there's this meme about how all landlords are assholes and all that stuff. And on one hand, I absolutely can sympathize with that because every landlord I've dealt with has been an asshole. But it's still just a business kind of like any other. It's just usually rich to well-off people or people who don't deserve it end up in possession of property and, they lord over other people or whatever. But, in Canada, everybody's a complete asshole. So these laws obviously exist for a reason, even in absolute liberal hell. So if a liberal hellscape has these kinds of laws, it's because these precedents are extremely common. Right. Kind of like we don't have protection for animal abuse or even like child abuse in this country. So for laws like that in the real estate to exist, there has to be a good reason for it. And I can see it because all the landlords we've dealt with, they basically, like the last landlords, They didn't give us any forewarning at all that they were selling their other place. So they just sold it and just sprung it up on us with day. Oh, by the way, we're moving back in. So get the fuck out.
What the fuck?
And we had no warning at all. So at least this landlord gave us some warning, but that warning was so fucking stupid. Where they're like, you guys are going to be out in December, right? And they come over like, what was that, halfway through November or something like that? Or
With
at the end of the month prior.
Yeah.
And we're like, what the fuck gave you that idea? Like, we communicated last time very clearly that we were going to need to be here for a long time because there's literally nowhere to go. We've had this conversation literally dozens of times. Just stupid as all. Fuck, yeah. So, yeah, we have nowhere to go. My health is really bad. I have, like, lumps in my back, and I don't know what they are. And they've been there for, like, a year or so. Could be cancer, you never know. No way to find out, of course, because,
Yeah, your best bet is like WebMDing or whatever the fuck, which is not usually
I
reliable.
just tried to, like, it could be lymphoma. Like, I don't know. I was trying to figure out those lymph nodes between your shoulder blades because that's where it is. But Google is fucking useless, and WebMD will just say you have cancer.
Yeah, WebMD's
Literally,
meme is that it's always cancer.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, can't rule out cancer.
It's
Yeah.
stupid.
The
But
other
yeah,
thing that I've noticed about trying to search anything, and this isn't necessarily strictly related to browsing like medical
Searching
results or
is
whatever,
hell.
it's just terrible now because everybody's tried to do search engine optimization.
Yeah.
And they've ruined the idea that you can find what you're looking for just by like searching certain terms.
Yeah, so I don't need to use the internet very much, actually. But that has changed with Unreal. Because I tried to, like, say, for example, you had issues where you couldn't open your project.
Yeah.
And it was an error I never run into, so my first gut is to go search for it on the internet.
Yeah, which is exactly what I did, and it was zero.
Absolutely useless. Like, always so useless.
That's
it doesn't
the
help
problem.
that their answer hub is awful, too, but, like, the search engines are worthless.
I used to feel really bad for asking people questions that seemed like they could be really easily found on there used to be that website, Let Me Google That For You, which is like a passive-aggressive version of like just telling you to Google it, and then after it does that, it's like, was that so hard? ? Or whatever. But now it actually is fucking hard because you can't find anything. It's really messed up. So
yeah. The other time I have to use the internet, of course, is when I'm searching for art for D&D. And I have actually a really nice rant about that in one of my last Autumn Wind videos that I processed, where I was looking through DeviantArt and other stuff, and it's like all these websites are filled with just manure. People just uploading like fucking MS Paint scribbles. There is no way to filter this shit out on these websites at all. No. And now we've entered, of course, the AI-generated hellscape. And the problem with AI-generated art is that it's all bad. AI can't do anything at all.
The best kind of samples come from stuff where it's like literally just copying and pasting stuff, like from an existing. And then it's like, well, it wasn't really generating that. So,
yeah, those are very, very rare, though. And you have no way to find those either. So it's really just like, just generic. Look, it's art. And it's just like, look at the fucking hands. Look at the eyes. Look at the rest of the goddamn image. HGS went through the whole process of setting up Linux and stuff and trying this stuff out because it could be useful.
Sure, yeah.
Maybe theory. If the meme was real and AI was going to start actually replacing artists, which the only people actually worried about that are bad artists, it's dead in the water. It's not going to happen for a great many years because holy shit is AI art bad. And now, thankfully, we're starting to see a little bit of pushback on marketplaces where they're like list AI-generated products. Of course, people have to actually register their product as AI-generated.
Yeah, you have to rely on user tagging because there's not a way to detect it beyond just using your eyes, I guess. But there's not a way to automatically detect it, right? So
so it's just like that's muddied up a lot of stuff. But it's like just the general process of trying to find art is like on DeviantArt. One of the examples I gave is let's look up fox art. Let's look up kitsune art. And I think I get like one relevant result out of like 4 or 5 pages. And that's consistent all across the board. Only Yandex and other non-oath-based search engines are remotely usable. And it's so simple shit. But you've got these multi-billion-dollar companies and their algorithms, and they're really not there to help you find results. They're there to help you have more user engagement so they can drive advertisements, data mining, and that's where their money is. So that's what they're most interested in. Yeah. And it's dreadfully bad to find actual information. Like if I was let's say if I was in education or in a workplace and I had to find actual real world data on XYZ, good fucking luck, because even simple subjects you can't find shit on.
Yeah, it would just be a disaster. I think it's kind of messed up because it used to be that this was just provided free of charge, and now we're getting into the point where, like, and this is true across the space of software in general, in that if you want something, like, you would almost rather pay for a good solution that actually does what it's supposed to do, because, like, software has degenerated, or in this case web searching has degenerated to a point where it's just not useful anymore. But like that's been the slow trend, or maybe not so slow trend of in general. It's like what you used to get just by going to google.com or whatever is now something that, I mean, there doesn't exist a good solution to my knowledge, but if there did, somebody would probably paywall it, right? And so then you're just like, what the fuck do I do then? I guess I have to pay for this thing. Like and of course everything is a subscription instead of a one-time purchase anyway. So it's not even like you can actually say, like, when I use used to use Explorer, just default Explorer, and then I figured out, there's this software called Groupie that just like combines Windows, and you can use that to basically have browser chat. I don't know why this isn't a default feature, and I guess in Windows 11 they added it along with all their other shit that nobody wants. So I was like, yeah, okay, I'll pay $5 for that, whatever. And then I was shocked to see that it was not a subscription. Like, I was shocked to see that it was just a one-time purchase, and I like, yeah, great. Why not? So that's the kind of thing that's just insane to me, is like people, I mean, it would kind of be like, I know you spend money on Unreal plugins and stuff. It would kind of be like if everything that, like, if you couldn't actually implement anything sensible, like without a ridiculous amount of basically like exploratory work to remove ambiguity, because there's no actual documentation anywhere. And then these plugins come in, but they like rank you for your subscription services and stuff. It's like,
there are plugins that do that. In fact, Arc Survival Evolved is using such a plugin for their Skybox, I believe.
What the fuck? A subscription service plugin for a Skybox?
Yeah, I believe that's what it was. I mean,
okay. What the fuck?
And there's a lot of shit like that. Like, as far as software is concerned, Mindtex remains probably the most well-earned purchase of production software I've ever had, because Substance used to be, they would push actually Steam releases after a while, which were basically just regular licenses.
Yeah.
You buy it, you have all the licenses for updates and stuff for this version. But then they got bought by Adobe, and you can imagine how well that went. And then that's it. Their product is dead now. And most people are trying to move on to other alternatives. And it's just like the cycle will just keep continuing, because the developers never gave a shit about the end users, or this would never have been on the table to begin with. So long as people don't give a shit, and so long as they aren't held to standards, that's precisely where you're going to keep ending up. It's just, you end up with programs that could be very useful. And I mean, Substance is a core part of modern pipelines, but they actively fucking sabotage themselves and make it more miserable for everyone on top of it. And Adobe as a company shouldn't even exist anymore. They haven't done anything useful for decades. Just bloat, 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 buy, bloat, bloat, bloat is just like the fucking dope fish of modern software. Is ridiculous. And that's with everything. That's Autodesk, it's Adobe, that's Blender, that's everything. It's just bloat. And because that's job security.
Yeah, it's we talked about the YouTube UI updates in a similar vein, right? It's just literally doing some repetitive, useless task that does not actually do anything productive, and it's securing your salary as it is.
That's what it all, because as we've seen by end products, developers have the lowest standards of everyone.
Yeah.
So they're not going to hold their own software and the software they use to any standard at all.
Yeah, they just like, oh, that's how it is, and they accept it and they move on. It's very similar actually to how consumers accept like the shitty products that they're well, that's just the way. Like like when there was that one amazing Steam review that I quoted where they said that. This game is not finished, or something. This game is buggy. It's early access or something, and it shows something like that. But then they said, "I think that's just gaming in general these days." And this, by the way, this review was positive. It was a thumbs up. Yeah. So it's like, I do think Fagudo's on point when he says that Steam reviews are good, like good for a laugh anyway.
Yeah. Anytime I look at Steam reviews, you get these people that make like this formatted post to try to make themselves appear like there's some kind of authority or something like that. And then the content of the post is just like raw, unfiltered autism that just you can literally feel your brain cells screeching as they burn alive.
Well, they also have like, you'll see a template every now and then where they like that's
what I'm talking about. Yeah.
The template
the
is
fucking template posters. Look at me. I'm a games reviewer.
Yeah.
Oh, this game looks so beautiful. It's fucking Doom Eternal. Come on, man. Open your fucking eyes. Holy
standards are pretty low, but you know what? We hold ourselves to higher standards here. And so I wanted to talk with you because you recorded a CMBW ramble.og file and sent it. I posted it in the server, and it was...
absolutely professional tier service there.
Yeah, of course, yeah. So, and I was appreciative of... I mean, there are some things that I think you might have been misremembering or whatever as far as like positions I had taken, but the main thing...
It's just like it's like a combination of like observations, just reading discussions or whatever. So
yeah.
I don't think a lot of that stuff we've ever actually discussed.
Not much. I probably many moons ago discussed when we still had shared units in the game where there was like some units that were in the... for like the cohort was one example where Zerg could morph it and Terran could train it and stuff.
I was actually wondering where the fuck that went because I remember being confused. There was obviously some kind of tech tree overhaul between the versions that I was playing.
Yeah. So before we had the units data extender, I wanted some way to pad the roster count for all of the races, and shared units were a really useful solution for that because you literally had one unit that could do double duty depending on which races had the overlap.
Duty.
Exactly. So the main thing that I ended up taking away from that was I actually did appreciate the fact that like it was kind of interesting. It's sort of like also like a hack for exploring, team game compositions because normally you'd have to have your other teammate do this, but you could actually do it in single player now because you could have like a shared unit or whatever. So I think it was an interesting experiment. I don't really think that it worked out super well from a thematic standpoint necessarily. Like some of the units were interesting explorations, but because they were copied over, like one of the things that I really took home from the CMBW ramble.og file was you saying that if you have some sort of mind control type thing where it's an ownership change, there should be some alteration to the unit that makes it more like whatever took it or something, meaningfully changed from whatever it came from. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And it also is something that I think would naturally benefit the way that it would naturally benefit the experience of using whatever that is. And so you actually gave Infestation as an example. I'm not sure if you remember the Akistra Corps actually using that. There was one of your first games, maybe in that unlisted video that I have on the channel somewhere, where it's you playing CMBW with Veek and myself. Veek actually uses it and controls a bunch of...
I wondered if that was even still in the game because I've never seen it since then.
yeah. It's not very commonly built. But it does infest any structure.
I remember looking for it.
Yeah, it infests any structure, and it as a result of that, like the way that the structure kind of works is that if you infest a structure and it's a production structure, it will spawn larvae. Any structure will spawn creep, like spread creep. And it gives you this opportunity to turn enemies' production into your own, but you also still have... like the ability to train, like if you infest a barracks, you can train a maverick or whatever, you know what I mean? So you can still, or you can build the add-ons and stuff. So there's sort of like the alteration, but there's also sort of just, here's my copy-paste thing. And what we were thinking about this, Veek and I, we're just sort of discussing, like, in that particular case, you could probably make any sort of like the infestation mechanic works that if you destroy the infested structure, it regresses, just like Zerg building mutations. It regresses
Just like Canadians.
into like a version of the barracks that isn't infested, and it goes back to the original owner. And so you could imagine that if you passed that on to the units that were trained for it, if they inherited the original owner internally and the infestation mechanic of regression back to the original owner, then you would have this natural push and pull where like they are different than what they were, because now if I do train a Phobos from an infested nanite assembly, then you get the Phobos after you kill it, you know? So like you get it back, or whoever. If it's an FFA, then that would be even more crazy, obviously. But stuff like that I think is actually pretty interesting as an idea, and also makes it consistent in general, and probably like allows for that sort of thing to happen. So that was definitely one thing that I feel like, you know, we can try to filter the mind control and ownership abilities through that kind of lens of like, how can we make it so that this is meaningfully different than just the unit is now owned by my enemy. But the other thing that I thought was maybe even more impactful, because ownership changes are going to be more common now that Reclamation is in, but it's not super common. It's not even something you'll see in every game. The thing that would affect every game is the early game pacing, and this is something that I've been trying to wrangle for a bit now, where I want to extend the time played at Tier 1, but that implies that you can actually play safely. And so, like, you know, I would like there to be this sort of exploration of your Tier 1 options as a Terran player. You might open with Fulcrum, and then you might start adding, you know, bio with especially Medbay from Barracks, and then maybe, obviously you need the Ant Seal for detection, but maybe you throw out a couple rates for harassment or something, you know, or drops and stuff.
Or a lot of wraiths to harass Veek specifically.
Yeah. So, like, that kind of stuff, I think that sort of ebb and flow of like moving through, and sometimes you won't. Like, it's not something I want to be prescriptive. I don't want it so that you have to build all 3 production structures as Terran at the beginning, or all 3 tech centers as Zerg.
I think you'd have a hard time with that, because a lot of people are going to want to go to Tier 2 no matter what.
Yes, yeah.
And like, say, in the Wraith example in particular, that's such a massive gas investment that unless you're going for a cheese, or you really need the Ant Seals, like if it's like a really aggressive early game, you're usually going to try to avoid that as much as you can. Well,
I was actually thinking that we might end up seeing like Wraiths cost 150 minerals and no gas or something to allow for that a little bit more or whatever. But like, you know, these are sort of the initial objectives I have, is like allowing you to explore Tier 1 for longer without basically throwing the game. Like, if you... I want it to be an actual decision. Like, do you actually save all your gas, and do you save all of your stuff for the tier up sort of side of things, and do you try to just secure an early advantage? That was always what Tier 1 was about, is like, I can either conserve my gas spending, like Zerg has this really intuitively, because you either build Hydras, which cost gas, or Quasis, which don't cost gas, and don't cost as many minerals, but aren't as cost efficient. And so you can choose to like still try to have a map presence, but secretly be teching up, or maybe not so secretly, be teching up behind it, like saving up for the tier up. Or you can be getting more powerful units, and like the Goliath or Drakodin or whatever would be examples.
Oh my god, we're going into toaster mode. Holy shit.
Toaster mode? Oh, is it?
You turned into... I'm having a Canada moment, I guess.
We can still make this work, Mess. Just tell me about pacing. Talk to me about pacing. Maybe.
Yeah, my ping is now up to 4,000. It's like this, just it's crazy. Yeah, the pacing. So what I know, like, you have kind of the problem when you have like a limited sample size.
Yeah.
Because you have so and so many players. But it's also the sample size, while their skill, like, I still stand by the logic that most of the people are still sort of around the same skill level, but there's like some weaknesses, particularly in tendencies like build orders and stuff like that. And most people are going to play to win one way or another. And someone's going to find something to win. Now, with CMBW is most games are solved very early into the match, because someone finds something consistent like Hydrock, and then we'll just play it all the time because it wins. That's the whole point, is to win. So if you don't do well in mid-game, or you don't know how to handle it well, or so on and so forth, you're just going to tend to doing the same thing. And it's much easier and faster to end the game within 3-4 minutes than it is to hold out until tier 2, tier 3, and run the risk of, my opponent also has tech, and now, I'm not entirely sure how to deal with this, or, a lot of people actually fatigue as the game goes on, and it's also the fault of modern gaming is all about instant gratification and low engagement. Like StarCraft 2, for example, is very low engagement. Try to end the game within 10, 15 minutes. That's why they removed early game entirely. Faster, more intense, etc. Content is best consumed within individual tweets. That's how modern games are designed. So a lot of people don't come into this with pre-existing expectations unless they have existing Brood War, and at least a few of the players don't have much, if any, existing Brood War experience. So it's very, very different kind of experience to come into this. There's also a fact that as Brood War evolved, you started seeing more and more safe maps. Because of, I didn't really follow it in the first half of its professional scene. So there was probably certainly a mindset that went down there. And I haven't really read too much into mapping for Brood War, actually. But my guess of it was because all-ins and stuff like that were always so strong. It's probably particularly from Zerg. And rather than try to brute force down the game balance, because Blizzard had, early into the game's lifespan, had abandoned it, and there was going to be no real balancing patches, certainly not to the CMBW level we saw with every other product thereafter by a variety of developers. So the maps were done for the balancing, and then you would see the evolution of the builds, where some builds became too strong in certain maps or whatever, so the maps were adjusted. But you never saw to the extent of like LMAO, Destructible Cox blocking every expansion just to stop Zerg or all this other stupid shit. You saw more safe maps show up where it was possible to block entrances. And that became very common for both Terran and Protoss, and sometimes, rarely, even Zerg would try to block the entrance, and then that would lead to more safety. And then, and you can't really do that in CMBW. There's a couple of maps you can kind of do that, but the vast majority of them you can't. So all-ins, or at least very, very aggressive early play, is virtually impossible to stop. Some of the bases are even just right out in the open. There are no choke points. Some maps have 2 or even 3 ramps. The ramps are also larger than they were in StarCraft. So even in the rare case where you end up with just a single ramp, it becomes very difficult to actually block it, especially when, in generally speaking, in spite of the fact there is no supply structures, and in part because of the fact there's no supply structures, the actual process of walling it up is really, really expensive, and you're not going to be able to do it that quickly because in comes faster, units come out faster, and units travel the map a lot faster as well. There's also the relationship of armor penetration versus buildings, especially Zethra-cores, and to a smaller extent, Draconans can go through buildings quite quickly, but especially Zethra-cores. It's actually really funny how fast they kill buildings, but that's because Ling speed and stuff like that no longer exists. They're just fast by default. So, like, some misplay can just see half of your workers get instantly killed, or critical buildings can die within just like 4 or 5 seconds. Like when Shambler takes out my Quasark pool in one game, I was like, how the fuck did they kill it so fast? Holy shit. And that's just because Zethra-cores are so lethal against buildings now. So, but like, that's how you win the game. Like, it's very safe to do that if you see a timing push available, or you know a player is going to go maybe a more economic build, or the map. One of the problems I have is that I think the map distances, because I see the big maps, I think in terms of Brood War, I don't really have too much to worry about super early on because the units won't cross the map that fast. Well, they do cross the map that fast, especially Zethra-cores and Hydras. You don't have to wait for the upgrades on those. They just fly across the map and they're suddenly in your base. So you no longer have the slower navigation speed of tier 1, basically. You don't have those gaps between I have a unit and now the unit is at its full strength, which means that the balance again shifts very much towards early game pressure. And now, so what you developed as a result of all these different interactions and then the viability of those interactions is you have a group of people who either are super aggressive early on, which is like you and Shambler, and then people who tend to be a little bit more passive early on, like to an extent, Veek or Kian. Now, they can sometimes do very early stuff too, but I think they tend more towards tier 2 stuff. They don't really like apply like constant pressure. Same with like Knight of the Realm. I played against him, and there was a little bit of early pressure, but we basically like the most major fighting started happening in tier 3. And
sure.
like it was just like very different. So then you can kind of see like where those players might really struggle against someone like you or Shambler, because you just attack them early on. It totally fucks them up, and it's part like habits, and it's also in part, the play style. So well, that means that in terms of pacing, because this is your sample pool and your sample size, is your pacing is super nuclear fast, because that's how the games are being solved. So I think that even if you delay tier 2, even if you strengthen static defenses, you're probably still going to see people, they're just going to try to figure out ways to still solve the game early, because it's still going to be quite viable. And that can cause issues for your pacing too, right? Because, let's say a game enters tier 3, you don't really know how those units are going to perform that much. Like, I didn't even know the Ion or Anti-Chthon even existed until we played that game, and I built the Anti-Chthon, and it's like, holy shit, how does Zerg actually deal with this in their current state? At the time, Gezis could attack air, I think, still, so they were like my gut instinct. It's like, you got to kill them before they get within range of you. But
they're
if you can't spam them. Yeah, they are still grounded. So I guess you could still try to do that. But it's like beyond that, it was like the toss scrolls were getting exploded. All the groundians were getting exploded. It's like there was very obvious was like the unit's very slow. If you kill them all at once, you can probably get rid of them. But you don't really know how it's going to interact. From a design perspective, it's like kind of like a black box, because you don't really get to see it too often. And from a player perspective, it's also a black box, because like this is a super expensive unit. I'm not going to see it in like 99% of games. When I get to the stage in the game where I can build these, what is the right choice to do? There's no longer like even a goal or objective. It's more like you're trying to like feel your way around blindly, because the pacing of the game completely changes when you hit tier 2, and it changes again when you hit tier 3, because like ever so slight mistakes can see like half the map just suddenly blow up. And it changes, which is good, but it's also like it's hard to predict, because the sample size is really not biased for that. And like with Zerg in particular, I don't know what to do. Like I didn't even know how the fuck you get ultra cores. And I didn't even know that those infesting units even still existed. So I understand Zerg tier 2 to a small extent.
Right.
But almost every game I played with Zerg, it's like you have to get early Volva cores. You have to either turtle up with Circuit colonies, or somehow hold a fast expansion, or you have to pressure them as fast as possible, or you got an Aethercore cheese. And it's like, I don't know what to do past that. So, because that's how every game has to go. It's like, if you don't do this, you will die, especially since the Zerg worker count is really, really, really fragile. And if you do take a really huge loss early on and you're not able, like if your opponent is competent, unlike me, where I can kill half your workers and still lose, then you're just going to lose to like the next push. And it can be really hard to navigate that. So that makes the early game feel like a coin toss, where it's like, if you don't do this...
Well, ZVZ in particular is super volatile, right? Because of the fact that you have the workers.
Yeah. And the fact that Zethar can kill everything so quickly, too. Like, before, workers weren't really great fighters at all, but they were still, like, tanky enough to take a few hits, and they dealt some damage comparable to, like, 5 damage. And it was just because of the damage type systems that they could at least deal some damage. Like pulling workers wasn't the absolute end of the world. Even if you lost a few of them, if you killed an early push, you could maybe stabilize with it.
No.
In this, you can kind of do that sometimes, because you can still try to drone drill things, but like Zethar cores, even Mavericks will just chew through workers in an absolute instant. So is way more risky. Oh, I'm being called.
Well, my first thing back would be to say there's a couple of things that I have to be really careful about when trying to address the issues in terms of actually making changes. Because, as you said, maps play a part, play styles play a part, skill levels play a part. But the other thing, too, is that, like, what I do like about the early game right now is that choices do matter. Now, what you're saying makes me feel like, and I agree with a decent number of what you were saying. It does feel like choices might matter too much or in too much of a way that makes it a coin flip. And I think also a part of that is probably attributable to the fact that we no longer have like the build a barracks, then a factory, then a whatever starport. You know, like now you can just do whatever you want from the get-go within some restrictions, and obviously within resource-based restrictions. Like one of the things that I thought about, and I talk about in the latest Crow's Nest, is like, what if gas was just like you had a ridge and then your geysers were far away from your main, so you had to like either distance mine them or build like a forward base, which is more of a mineral investment, and that's how we would delay more gas-intensive strategies. So that would give you more of a mineral focus. Like maybe now you go more in the lattice gateway, or maybe you go more of a barracks opener, or if you do end up going for a fulcrum, it's going to cost you more minerals because it's going to take longer to get all of the distance mining stuff or whatever. Like that was just an idea that I had, and maybe I'll play around with. It also like adds indirect value for the town outpost things, because now you can put those for cheaper instead of putting a new command center down or whatever. And it doesn't hurt Zerg because they build macro hatches anyway. So like there's a lot of things where that kind of maybe would make sense, even though it's a bit of an avant-garde idea. And I was thinking about stuff like that, and I was thinking about how, what would that entail for how would it change the game? Like, would it even do the right thing? And I think also this would if this became the meta for map design, it also would beget some significant changes to the resources, or the costs rather, because suddenly you're in a situation where maybe your hydralisks are prohibitively expensive just being 25 gas because that's super hard to get or whatever, and so maybe they would stay at the same cost but get more stats or something. But either way, it would be pretty crazy. So I do feel like not knowing what the enemy is doing, even when you scout them, is probably like, that's mostly something that happens with Zerg, but you can also see it where if you see a lattice, you kind of have to build a watchdog as Terran or something like that for a tier. You should delay it usually. Like good play will mean that you just have like if you can
keep your scout there long enough to actually see what comes out.
Yeah. And then like you can delay it until later, because obviously they can always pivot afterwards. And this is sort of what we see with Zerg, is like if you see a Quasrock but no gas, then okay, well, you can't be Nathrakors pretty much. So, unless they harvested it beforehand, which would be pretty cheeky. But even then, I guess if they're getting gas, it could be Larvosk. So you don't really know for sure. So scouting is still very important, maybe more important than in Stock Brood War, I would say, because of the fact that you have more choices at your
A lot
disposal.
of the times in Stock Brood War, you can kind of infer what they're going to do based on the map and the matchup.
Yeah.
Like you would know that the Protoss is going to go Bizu build because they've got a pylon in front of their thing, and it's that map that there's an expansion, they're going to take it. So then you kind of just can infer that. Of course, you still want to scout because you would see like hidden tech more often, where they would especially like Dark Templar would be hidden. So
I also think it's I would really like for expansion first to be a valid strat in 1v1s, but it definitely feels like you need at least like a barracks or a Quasrock or whatever. And for Zerg specifically, you need a big investment. Excuse me, because you have to get like you pretty much need to do Quasrock Larvosk or something if you want to fast expand, and at that point it's not very fast. Like Terran can probably expand the fastest out of any race. But if they scout early pressure from like a Protoss building Drakodons or something, then they can't really spare the minerals. So, Veek was suggesting maybe lower the cost or something. I don't know if that's going to happen, but like there are maybe ways to do it. I would like to maybe we could explore maps with larger distances. We've already sort of seen that, and it does shut down a lot of early aggression, but maybe it's too binary in that sense. Like maybe then like Zethrakor run-bys are pretty useless by themselves usually in long maps because they already have some units to defend, but maybe I'm underestimating how powerful they would be, because maybe they would still be capable of swinging in and surrounding units or something. And if you force static defense or something, that's also worth just by itself, because that's a hefty investment most of the time.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. Like, a lot of it is still sort of like, I don't know to what degree the correction needs to be made without it being an overcorrection, because I also don't want to be like, one of the things that I think I can understand why some people mistakenly defend the 12 workers start for Legacy of the Void is that like they have the feeling that there's not really any choices being made. Now, you and I know that there are choices being made in the early game, even if you're, just planning your strat or whatever, that's still a choice. It gives you this time to expect what's happening next or whatever. But the fact that you start with 6 workers as opposed to 4, I was thinking like, okay, well, what happens if you start with 4? And I think really the only thing that happens is it just slows. It gives you like 30 seconds before the rest of the game happens, Yeah. Maybe that would be enough to adjust things, but also at the end of the day, it probably wouldn't establish enough. Like it wouldn't be alone. And the other thing too is that, I mean, beyond being jarring,
I think it'd be more relevant if you still had supply.
Yeah. I think the removal of supply is also something that has certainly elevated the
because you no longer have an investment in a supply early on, so that just means more military units, pretty much.
Yeah,
and like both just the no supply to get you, but also no investment into the supply.
Yeah, no resources spent on that. Yeah,
but it also means that there's less like windows for scouting as a result because that part of the game is faster. So
yeah, one of the things I was also thinking about is, there was a suggestion to make tech and production structures cost more time, but I actually wonder if maybe making them cost more money would be better, because if you do it that way, then you need to you have the early time for your first production structure, and like your first couple production structures, they take longer to build because you need to take you need to get the money. But when money is less of an issue, then you can build them as fast as you need, and maybe that would be one way to do it as well, because then it's more about the investment. Like I was also, we were debating whether to like remove like the tier 2 and 2, like the fractional thing where it's 0.5 for tier 2 and tier 3. In some ways, especially at 2.5, it does feel like you do get some benefit from splitting those things apart. But maybe also if you just get, when you hit tier 2 as Terran or Zerg, you just get the whole thing, but the 0.5 stuff is just priced more prohibitively, then you would almost be rolling the costs into that, and that might actually be fine. And I especially think this is the case for 3.5, especially for Zerg, where you only are unlocking 2 structures right now, and it's not really that much there, but you still have to put in this crazy gas investment. So yeah, I think that might be something that we do, is just make roll back the 0.5 changes, but take everything that was at 0.5 and just make it cost a lot more. So you can choose to dump all your money into it, but that might still be a risky decision, especially if it's scouted. That might be something we do, but that's also for later in the game anyway, right? That's not for the early game, which seems to be the spot that needs the most attention. So I think, when you're sort of assessing it, the main thing that I come away with feeling is that it would be nice if we could make the game safer without making the decisions less impactful, or maybe they need to be slightly less impactful for the game to be safer. But if that ramp up time, that warm up time before the real action begins and like game changing moments can be had, takes a little bit longer. I mean, people talk about accessibility features for RTS. That's pretty much the main thing you need, right? I feel like is like, if you want your game to be more accessible, I mean, I've said this before in like the content for the tutorials and stuff, you can still lose the tutorials in our planned RTS concepts, but it will take you a little bit before like the overwhelming force. Like maybe your opponent is very safe and conservative and they just contain you with a bunch of forward defenses or something, like stuff like that, because then it's teaching you like, okay, this is a defeat condition. This is something that can happen to me. And then it is also believable because your opponent isn't just like really playing poorly, and that's why you're winning. So I don't know. There's stuff like that where I feel like if the game just took a little bit longer to get to it, if we can achieve that without making the decisions less, interesting, and making the taking the skill ceiling and reducing it significantly. If we can achieve that, then I think we'll be in pretty good shape. I just don't know exactly what changes and how many of them to make just yet. So I'm not sure if that gives you any ideas now that I've framed the discussion that way.
Well, certainly it's something you don't want to just be like, oh, I got to change everything.
Yeah.
Because this is unprecedented territory. Nobody's really crossed this before. So you don't really have a lot to judge by to say, okay, so we're in this situation and this change will fix it. We don't know that. So if the formula changes too much at once, then it's going to be very hard to connect point A to point B to figure out how we ended up at point B when we hit so many variables and then suddenly we're at point B and it's like, okay, maybe we need to dial back something, but what would we dial back? That's why stuff like the corpse changes are important to do piecemeal because, hey, this is an interesting concept. We want to change the way some of these spells work, so let's introduce a corpse system. Well, from a mile away, you knew there was going to be problems, but what do those problems actually look like when you play the game? So, you can hypothesize them, but to actually see them allows you to gauge everything related a lot more accurately. That's why unit testing is so important and why you need to do unit testing and everything. Well, that's effectively what those games amount to, is unit testing.
Right.
So now you understand this is how this interacts, and then we have an actual case example to study the hows and the whys. And the same will be the case for the early game. Well, we have lots of sample sizes to look at for the early game, sure, but now if we change one thing, like if we change gas distances, that's going to affect the entire game. If we change production costs, it's going to change the entire game. If we change unit speeds, damage values, it's going to affect the entire game. So then that's going to make tier 2 and tier 3 also look very different. So we're going to be affecting, there's going to be a ripple effect that's going to affect every single thing from here onwards. So from this sample size that I have seen, it's still kind of hard to judge really what the best decision is. I think buffing static defense is one thing you can do, but that doesn't necessarily solve all the problems. It solves some issues. And in the long run, it really doesn't have that much of an effect, because people aren't usually going to build static defense early on unless they really need to. Again, if they can't figure out if they're going to get like Nather cores or whatever inside their base, not building defense just kind of opens you up to being just killed instantly. So, and then with different races, it's harder to predict. Like Terran can really early on only do one of two things. If they're going to Wraith Rush you, it's really telegraphed because you have to be harvesting gas for actually quite a long time. And if you see something like a single barracks opener, you've got like two bases, then you kind of can just infer, they're probably got hidden.
They got hidden tech somewhere,
yeah, and it's probably not going to be a fulcrum. So, they're a little bit more telegraphed in that regard. With Zerg, it's a lot harder because each Zerg structure has air and ground units, and two of those structures are quite heavy on gas, especially if you want to actually make use of the hydrox den. You pretty much have to be mining gas the entire time because everything comes out of it costs hydrox. If they go Zorkis, that's also going to come very late, and they're also really gas intensive, but just because they have Zorkis, until you see what actually pops out of the eggs, you still have no idea what it could be. It could be anything, which means you have to be prepared for both solutions. If you were going for an all-in, and you sent nothing but zealots, and they suddenly have Gorga cores, well, you're in trouble. If they have Lakizelisks, you're still probably going to be in trouble. So you just are in different kinds of trouble. So it's just with Zerg, they're very, very flexible. Each tech structure offers you a lot of different choices, and with Terran, it's like your tech structures early in the game. Well, the Fulcrum is probably the most flexible of all of them because the Wraith is going to be just cheese. And you probably won't see early Trojan in most of these maps. You don't need it. It's not the right investment. But I think that if you have larger maps, then you might actually see a Trojan rush. I'm thinking like Maverick spam into Trojan.
Yeah. I did that exact move because you can put 8 of them in a Trojan, which obviously is unchanged from Broodboard, but 8 Mavericks in your base with stim already given to them, and the U-238
higher attack speed than normal.
I think they have slightly high. You're right. Yeah, they do. And then obviously stim only dealing 5 damage as well. Like actually, people sleep on Mavericks because maybe they're not super good in an open fight or whatever.
It's like even if you have anti-air defense, you can just suicide the Trojan right on top of the worker line, pop stim, and unless they have like a bunker or something there, chances are the workers are going to take the auto acquisition and they're just going to all die.
Yeah, definitely can happen, as Kian found out yesterday. I was telling you that the games were Tismic. It's because the first game, I don't think you probably won't cast them, but I didn't even post them, I guess. So yeah, you definitely won't. Basically, the first game we both decided to drop each other, but I had 8 Mavericks, so his mineral line died, and there was a very retarded base trade that ensued where I just obviously lifted my structures and he couldn't kill me. So then he lost all his factories and died. Then the second game, we were both Protoss, and I decided I would do a one base Atreus, double Atreus drop. His army just walked into my base and started killing it. I snuck 2 Nexuses down and then killed his factories with the 2 Atreuses. It's the most stupid win I've ever had in the game, I think. So, yeah, those are not indicative of normal gameplay, but it was a sight to behold. But right before that, we had a pretty funny ZVZ that went on for much longer, where he sniped my main, Hacharosk, but I had 4 bases already, so it didn't really hurt that much. And just transfer the workers immediately, right?
Well, I like the one game I had where the 2 architects navigated the entire map through mid-game and then actually managed to kill your tier 2 tech.
Oh, right, yeah.
That was really unexpected. And it's just, the game is still very strange. And
yeah.
That's the thing when you have all these strange units that people aren't even really fully experienced in using yet, is they're just capable of things you don't. Like, you come into Brood War with a lot of expectations of how it's going to function and play, but
yeah, that's actually one of the good things about slowly remodeling some of the default assets too, is that like when they look different, you expect something different from them.
Yeah,
and now they all have been changed in some way. So
yeah, you really need, like, because especially with Draconins, the numbers are totally different on them. And you expect, like with Dragoons, you've just worked with them for so many years, so you expect them to do this much damage, behave this certain way. But I believe you even changed the movement, that the movement is no longer using the inordinate frame counts per frame for movement. So just the way that they navigate the map is completely different too. And I believe you probably did that for Zethicors, I imagine, as well.
Yeah, I think every unit has that now. Maybe Zethicors might have escaped, but I know Ultra Cores did get the treatment. Rillarocors, Brutespawn did get the treatment, and then Goliaths also had the same problem, so they also got fixed. Yeah. Now that everything's sorted, we can talk a little bit more in depth about basically the early game specific stuff. And actually, Veek had just posted a map that is set for 2v2, which looks very safe, actually. So that kind of brings me to my next point. We were talking about it a little bit earlier about map design and, the things that we might be able to do. Are there any observations? You've said before that the maps are very open or what have you, and that you mentioned that the ramps are harder to wall off or hold. I do think that walling is just not something I've given any consideration now that supply has been removed. There's been a few maps, like Terminus has that one cheeky spot you can put a single gateway or you can put a barracks or whatever. And especially now that rallies actually give you control over where your unit pops out. That can help you not get owned by like putting the unit in the wrong spot or something. You know what I mean? So I feel like that ends up being pretty significant. Technically, Zerg can even plant a Hacharosk there and get the...
I mean, you did see that a little bit in Brood War, especially in maps like Lost Temple. I've seen hatcheries get placed right next to the sometimes even really early into the game. Yeah. Right in front of the ramp there, and not even necessarily sometimes for sunken colonies, but also just to have early response or something, I guess. I'm not really sure. Sometimes you'd see sunkens, but
it also probably helps seal the gap for any vultures that might be trying to get in, I guess. That's the one thing I can think of.
If Bio tries to like surge up through the ramp, that they have to kind of navigate around it. The ramps are you supply made walling viable because supply depots, you were going to build those anyways, and your barracks and the supply depots could form a fairly safe choke to the point that you could even stop early scouts with it sometimes too. So
I've actually begun just building barracks and similar types of structures that are mineral only or heavy on the mineral side that can still give me some value, but I don't actually need them necessarily. I just use them for walling. I've started to do that, so it depends on what it is, but it can be useful.
With a bigger ramps, it's a lot harder, especially like early into the game, because 150 minerals is still quite a bit early into the match.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So, if you weren't already going bio, then it's kind of not very viable. But also, the Protoss is harder because the pylons are smaller now.
Yep. They are
So
smaller. All the
you,
collisions have also changed. So like the sizes of the boxes is different. So I'm sure there's
yeah,
just as many silly things you would have to learn. Like imagine if you know how there's like all these weird quirks where like a unit can go in this way but not in that not like one angle
yeah,
but not other. I'm sure like if you had no knowledge of any of that stuff, CMBW basically has you relearn it all anyway. So
hmm
like I'm sure there's the same level of silliness where some units can fit and others can and whatever. But you know,
I
and
think
so that's the thing.
I think it was a somewhat recent change where you re-implemented the height advantage.
Yeah, we fixed it. It was broken
Yeah.
for like 6 months
Oh,
or
I thought
something.
you had. I thought it was intentionally
No,
removed.
no. We were
I was
testing it
worrying
as a
about that.
debugger, and we just never. We debug like we made a version of the function that just never worked deliberately, so we could test something, and then we never turned it back.
Oh,
So I was
absolutely.
just,
I love doing that.
yeah,
That's a classic. So yeah, it's with the height advantage being back, that will make walling a little bit more viable, especially for Terran, because you don't even necessarily need a wall. You just need to plot like two bunkers at a good spot where. Sometimes I swear that the range bonus from bunkers is somewhat inconsistent. Like one of the matches I watched, where I think it was Keen against Shambler, the Mavericks couldn't hit an Exemplar. And there's other times that bunkers have been dropped near things, and it just didn't seem like that the range advantage was really there.
it's
And like
because of
it's
the way that Brood War handles range is like some. I'm pretty sure most of the time it's from the bounds of the unit. So like it's from the like the whatever the collision box is, you take that box and you use the outermost part of that box on like whatever side the target is on, and you compare that to the outermost part of the target's box to the left of that. Like if the bunker's on the right. Sorry, to the left of a target, and the target's to the bunker's right, then the left edge of the target will be compared against the right edge of the bunker, as an
mm.
example. It's not a consistent like circular range or whatever.
Yeah, I remember. I think DF was posting some images about the range as being weird too.
Yeah. It's
Yeah,
it's pretty silly. And
it's a
I might
little
not even have
strange.
gotten that description correct, by the way. This is just my understanding of it. So I
Yeah.
know some searches are like that. We've recently upgraded a bunch of internal searches. For one, it fixes bugs where like the Gladius bounce is bouncing to cloak targets or burrow targets. Stuff like that is fixed, but it also uses the rectangular searches, which is more accurate to ranges. So at least there will be consistency there. The main I think the main thing that needs to be resolved for that is just like the problem is that would sometimes affect games in Brood War, but it was known and the number of units was smaller, so you could kind of keep track of which interactions there were. Now it's like, oh, Exemplar's attacking a bunker from one side or whatever. It's like, well, that's just one of the fucking 300 units in the game. So how am I
Yeah.
supposed to keep track of all this stuff? So yeah, it can definitely get intense. But yeah, I think static defense is definitely in a spot where you can do pretty good stuff with it, especially if you have cliff advantage.
Yeah.
Obviously, that doesn't apply to air units. There was a version where it did, but it ended up being too prohibitive and also not very intuitive. But like in
Air
general, it
units
was
are
good.
hard to use as it is in many cases,
Yeah,
especially for Zerg, where you kind of depend on there not being sentinels or matrices. And if they had increased range against you, it would just be even harder to make use of melisks and calculisks.
yeah. I noticed you started using mutas recently, or you tried them out again. I think they were quite successful in the early stages before we got ion cannoned to death.
Yeah, before there was like 30 ion cannons on the map. Yeah. Yeah, I had some success with them. I was grouping them up with larva and trying to micro them, and they were doing fairly reasonably against the Gorgons. So
Yeah.
because I was noticing it was mostly like blackjacks coming after me, so
Yep.
they were not very mobile. So Amulis could do some hit and run on them, but then it turned into Gorgons, which was kind of really the same idea. They need a stack to debuff on you to slow you down, so you can.
And if they're
are
attacking like
taking
every
advantage of the fact
target
that we're at
once or
stack.
something because of the attack move or whatever, like if they're not focus firing, then it's really hard to do damage to kill a muta, but then also to like slow one down so that it can be picked apart, right?
Yeah, in that case, his meanless are nice to have because they're only what like 50 gas or something. So I was spamming my gas or my minerals mostly on Zethagors and Quasis at the point. So I had some gas to spare from mutas, and I needed to take some pressure off the map. So it worked all the way up until they got one shotted by an ion cannon, anyways.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we're working on the revision. I've actually just tagged DF for the ion targeter model, so we'll see what we can do with that.
The ion cannon, like, there's so many ways you could do the ion cannon. Like, one way I might consider it is to have it be a focused beam that has damage over time, and then its radius increases over time. Like, that's another idea. There's the delayed explosion. There's the tracer thing. But obviously, all these get really, like, increasingly difficult to implement in Brood War. So it's, you know, it's kind
the
of
only technical black box we have right now, for people who don't know, Brood War basically works that it will fire a weapon. So part of the iScript does actually, now that I think about it, that's not true. We can fix this pretty easy because we can read SIG order from iScript in GPTP and just change it. So,
does no break code prevent turning? I forget.
It prevents receiving orders, so you would still turn to track the target that you were attacking.
Okay.
Yeah. So, the first thing is, like, right now, the biggest problem with ion cannons for counterplay is that you can't make them waste shots on whatever target shows up.
Yeah,
which is exactly what's going to happen now.
And it wouldn't happen. They died
the units
too fast.
Died too fast from other things. So that exactly. So now, like, when we implement the revision, we're also going to add like a target fire, which, as long as you have like vision on something, you can task it. Like, you won't be able to task it in the fog of war or whatever. That way, you can decide to like override the target. Of course, if it's already started to targeting, then it can't be interrupted. Is still within the vision, but. Basically, what we can do is we can fire the tracker, which is going to be its own weapon. And then if the tracker, like, whatever the condition is for, like, the tracker existing or whatever, we can read that and then fire the weapon. Like, the concern was making sure that it always fired the weapon at the same target or something to that effect. Like, instead of tracking the unit, it would have to track the position. But I'm pretty sure we can just reassign the position manually to wherever the tracker went. And it's important that we make sure that we track where the tracker actually goes, because right now, like the Anseal, for example, will actually redirect projectiles. It was happening to my
I noticed the hit effects were on it, and I was thinking, this is kind of hacky.
Well, it's also, I mean, it's like that for hit scan attacks, like the Maverick or whatever. But I was using a Cantors, and the fucking Anseals were just moving them to the Anseal, which obviously it doesn't hit air units, so it's actually just nullifying them completely. So that was pretty funny. It was pretty good. So there's stuff like that, and maybe we end up having more bullet-related interactions where like the projectiles actually do meaningfully change in location, and if that happens to an ion cannon, then it needs to obviously update the position of the strike. So, yeah, that's definitely one thing. So like basically the revision is going to involve a lot more counterplay to the behavior if you are being attacked by something that actually can move. And so I think that's going to be a big deal. I'm actually not sure about whether or not they should even attack air units. I think the calculus changes with the unit pretty significantly if they can't target air units. If their splash still deals damage to air units, I think that's fine. But if they can't actually fire on air units, the unit it suddenly becomes a lot more sensible, because then you can like pick apart the defenses that are holding
at least the mobile air units, right?
Well, yeah, and I mean, even like you can use air unit artillery like Azithalor, Hippogriff, I guess, are the only two in the game right now. Like Empyreans kind of count, but their range is pretty low. You can kind of use stuff like that and still defeat them. I think that would probably make the like similar to the Gazithalor being a kind of a catch-all. I feel like ion cannons are probably in a similar boat. So maybe along with this revision, we'll also give a shout out to seeing if it can be ground only and still be balanced. Because the other thing is, if it ends up being significantly reduced in power, then maybe we can give it power back in some other way. We can maybe reduce its cost or something, right? So that 2v2 game we played was probably a game where like I felt like I was enjoying the mod the least in that game because I just kept feeling like I mean I didn't play very well. I had like 7k minerals or whatever, but I really didn't know what to build. Like
I think they were putting more pressure onto you than me, but I was like almost in the position where I could actually like it felt like I was just about in a position where I could take out like half of Beaver's bases because he wasn't able to deny my expansions very much, and I'd killed so many of his units.
Right.
But then the two bases I was using for most of my gas income in the middle of the map just died to ion cannons, and I couldn't defend them because of the ion cannons.
Yeah.
And it was like, well, normally I would just use what I was getting close to tier 3. I would just hold out and get heavy artillery. But then I couldn't do that because the ion cannons crept closer and closer, and then I couldn't protect the gnats or anything else. And it was like the Melisks were no longer, I couldn't kill the air units of the Melisks because the Melisks all died to ion cannons. So I was like, well, I would normally spam ultra cores, but I don't actually know how to get them, and now suddenly I don't have the gas to get them anymore.
Right.
So like it just instantly flipped around, and it was like, well, obviously there was something that went wrong that they hit tier 3 before I did, but it was also Zerg tier 3 just feels much harder to hit in general because it's
this
really
this
gas
patch was
expensive.
supposed to increase the cost of the data love, but it didn't. So that also didn't help
Yeah.
us. So yeah.
Yeah, that probably did not help that much. And then I was like, well, the next thing is to make Vorpal cores, which are tanky enough to take some sentinel hits, and it's not like they had a huge army to begin with. So the Vorpal cores were making it to the ion cannons.
You might have wanted maybe zero cores or Zoryustaleths. Zoryustaleths will die in one ion cannon shot, I think, but they will take a lot more hits than a Vorpal core, for example. So you might have benefited from that. But
yeah, I just wasn't sure. Like if they had military, I wanted the Vorpal cores to be able to slow them down and kill them too.
And also, like, because the Vorpal cores stay alive long enough, maybe the Ion Blast would actually hit them, and then obviously, like, kill all of their units.
I figured that the Ion Cannons would miss them because they were moving fast to the middle of the map, but it just really wasn't turning out that way. They were ending up in their base, but then they were mostly dying to Sentinels. I think Beaver said that an Ion Cannon did end up wiping one of his worker lions.
Love that.
Yeah, it was. They probably had a lot of minerals anyway, so... Yeah, it was just, I think, I saw you trying to use Star Sovereigns against them, but I wasn't really paying attention to that much to the side of the map.
It kind of worked a few spots. I did glass, like, I think I glassed 6 ion cannons in total, but the fact that that's not even half the ion cannon count means we are already destined to lose.
Well, it was like, it went from nothing until I scouted, and I saw, like, 3 or 4 ion cannons, I was like, holy fuck.
Yeah, how did they
Where
did
all this shit come from?
Yeah, I don't really know how the pressure wasn't enough, but we probably just didn't deny enough bases. Anyway, I wanted to point out
I got set behind a little bit early on, I think, because I had to take that other base, and it was like getting harassed quite a bit. So that might have slowed me down too much. But it took Beaver. Like Beaver only took that base, I think, after I took it. So it was. I don't know how they had the money for that, but I think Veek just kind of like went hard into the.
Yeah, he did. He didn't have very many units, is the thing. Like that's why I was able to do the glassing, because he didn't really protect his stuff with anything other than sentinels.
Yeah, like I said, it was mostly blackjacks and vultures running around the map until the Gorgons showed up.
He had a couple madrigals and phalanxes and stuff, but they weren't in the position, and then they walked in and died anyway. So like there were some spots, but then it got to a point where like Beaver amassed too many air units. So
yeah, well, that's why like even in Armageddon Onslaught. One of the last things added to it, I don't know if they ever actually built it too much, was actually artillery. But it had it was like Valkyrie attacks that were random. And obviously in Apex, the artillery was also random. That's why they had the inaccurate... when they targeted the ground, it was more inaccurate. Nowadays, I probably wouldn't have accuracy. But I was trying to think of, okay, if I made artillery always accurate... Now, these are anti-ground only. Except the Zerg actually fired... This is something you might... try to do. It probably is really difficult though. Is the destructible projectiles? The Zerg had an anti-air homing artillery. It was called Warm Feces, but it had health and armor, so you could shoot it down, just like the seeker missiles could be shot down. So that was how I balanced anti-air artillery. But nowadays, it's like I think I would have to rely really heavily on the SDI system to balance artillery in that, because I would probably want to remove the randomness for it.
Right.
Especially when you hit like the high tiers where you have huge artillery, it might actually hit whatever it's firing at and instantly kill it, or it could miss like 30 shots. So the inconsistency was something I was never really sure of, but I didn't have real testing data for it.
Well, that's why one of the things I was interested in is that if you had ever gotten a version of the Apex Bunker Rush map or whatever, even though it was in StarCraft 2, I would have been very interested to give that a try and stuff. But also, I think, and maybe you can echo this, is like just like when you shipped the first voyage of Apex X and you saw like wildly different sort of styles or a way to approach it. I think when you have PvP games, it becomes significantly more like interesting, I guess, but also just wacky and like, how do people actually approach this, and specifically how do they approach it when they're fighting each other and stuff. So I think it's like I
literally went triple star pad versus 2v2.
Yeah. Why not? That's epic. And
that was more viable. So
I think I just think that like Veek was talking about this in the latest Crow's Nest, and how he feels like the mod is coming into its own and blooming a lot more now that we have player versus player action, like in the last month or whatever, where it's really picked up. And I think that is pretty epic. Like it's just. it's neat to, like, even though we have all this rocky stuff and like, oh, what do we do about ion cannons? What do we do about early game pacing and stuff like that? Like, I think if we can make it so that the early game is a bit safer, but you still have useful and interesting decisions to make, so we don't like sacrifice too much at the altar of that, then we'll actually be in a really, really nice spot, because then we can more frequently assess the mid and late game flow and options and etc. Like sycophants and other units that are like super late game just aren't usually used too often, and so they might be really underwhelming. Alcagelisks are another victim of that, where like very expensive to get and then they kind of don't do as much as you would want them to do. So it's like, what do we do about that?
Their description is artillery, but they have to walk into the defenses.
What Alcagelisks do?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
They're nothing like the land units you use to kill the ion cannons in one of our games.
Yeah, Cascade.
I was like, oh yeah, they actually have range. The Zerg finally have artillery, but then it's like, I think these units always existed. We just never saw them.
They have 14 range. They used to only have 13 range, but +1 is important, bro. So.
Oh yeah, broke 3. I don't know how important that is.
Well, we did that with Vulture Mind Count.
Some sacrifices are too much to make.
Yeah. So anyway, I think stuff like this is. It makes sense that, like you said, this is unprecedented territory where nobody's really expected to or attempted anything like this, and that part of it definitely makes me feel like, fills me with some hope that like, okay, we can actually find our way out of it, because it's not like there's some obvious solution necessarily staring us in the face that we're not seeing. I do think that safer maps will go a long way, and maybe we'll just sort of slowly plot along, iterating on it from there, and buffing static defense, which I recently did in terms of durability, will probably go a long way. And maybe, like something else that I was thinking about is maybe increasing the individual costs of air units in tier 1 specifically, or, modifying their costs or whatever, but then also significantly improving their power budget or whatever. I feel like that might make it a little bit too binary, but if you make it so that it takes, I did this with the Panoptus, I increased the time cost by 5 seconds in the latest big update. And it's like, yeah, this unit, I mean, we have to figure out what's wrong with the fucking banking or flingy or whatever. But aside from that, it's like this unit is very, very powerful in terms of its durability, its stats, its weapon, But especially considering it can be built not necessarily cheaply, but it can be accessed early on. You can imagine this unit being really, really powerful. So like maybe one of the ways to make it a little bit more balanced is that you can't be as numerous with it, and so. Anyway, I just feel like stuff like that is a way to push the game into a healthier state without denying the importance of the decisions that led you to the moment where you're, winning or losing or whatever. Like, even if the game takes longer, but it just takes long to close and the resolution is obvious, that's not really a good direction to put it in either. So yeah. I want to be careful with that, but that's why I appreciate us sort of reflecting on it. And I mean, you've said before that this is like pretty much the only mod you've really invested in, or only project you've really invested a lot of time in recently. And I feel like, I can pretty comfortably say that even though there might be some rocky roads with ion cannon spam or what have you, I still do feel like it's the best RTS experience I've had. And I could say that fairly confidently in that sense, even though it's obviously still very avant-garde and we're still figuring out like some issues with the rough edges. And like, for example, as just in terms of judging the project overall, like the art is still definitely a fucking scrap cobble mess. Mm-hmm. And so, maybe we don't have enough content, we don't have enough maps, we don't have any campaigns. Well, we do have actually one campaign, which you even donated voice acting for. So we do have some content, but, we need to big up that and continue the approach and stuff. And also, what you mentioned in the one of the castovers, I think it was on the ice map where there was Ion Wars, you mentioned that the AI hasn't seen too much work recently. And I do think we should try to, beef that up a little bit, especially as we get into the in-game entity limit extenders. Once we finish those, we'll have more reason, I guess, to play longer games, and then we'll want the AI to be more, useful or whatever.
I think the most pressing thing to fix is the desyncing.
Yeah.
Because over half of your games with team players get desynced.
It does seem
so.
I don't know what's
that's a really big issue for sure.
The stability is definitely a problem, and we don't really seem to be able to track it down. But and I just hope that it's something that has like one single cause to it. I think also like the replay instability and shit the frame one dropping. That's just annoying. If we can at least resolve that, then we can do better.
They may all be related,
Yeah.
You need to find some some way to set up a testing environment. Like I was mentioning when in Fraudarchy that
Yeah.
a way to go about it is maybe to use virtual machines or a second computer or something to set up a multiplayer game, and then be like, you said Visual Studio is not very useful for actually debugging this, but at the very least, you could try to unit test stuff and like you figure out like what were problem spots. Well, if you think nukes are a problem spot, that would be one way to test it. Look in the FFAs and figure out what tech were people at, what were they doing, and you kind of just try to work your way around that, because it is definitely really frustrating to have games drop. And
Yeah, of course. It's like all the investment,
especially
like,
when it's like you only gather like once a week, and then like
Yeah.
half the games don't even work. Like
Yeah.
that's going to kill a lot of momentum.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, stuff like the Ion Cannon, it's like I've played StarCraft 2. I played Supreme Commander. There are games that they're far more broken than the Ion Cannon. What the Ion Cannon does to this. So,
Okay.
it's a fairly minor grievance in the long run of things, for sure. It's like the RTS has been a mess for a very long time. And I mean, I think back even on Conquest Frontier, where it was one of the most obnoxious things, and that was the fucking invincibility on the dreadnoughts, where if they had supply, they could just remain invincible forever. And even with the AI, it was just irritating as hell. And it's like, yeah, all these RTS games are usually really badly designed, and they have just really glaringly awful things that, like Warcraft 3, everything about it. StarCraft 2, Immortals, Roaches, Marauders, like very beginning of the get game, you're put into what is just plainly unfun. So it's, there's growing pains, and I think right now you're just in the age of discovery. So things will just continue to change, and maybe you'll find different places you want to be.
Right, yeah. That's definitely one of the things, like, we're experimenting with our own RTS title that we're going to be releasing later this year. The experiment is built around the idea that we're going to try a slower pacing from the get-go. Like, the intentional design is that it takes longer to accrue resources, it takes longer to establish bases and stuff, and we want to make it so that you can still do significant, you can still make significant decisions there. And, what does that do to map design, for example, skirmish content or something to that effect? Like, do we try smaller maps so that actually, even though you can you take longer to build stuff, you can maybe use the opportunity to scout more, and you can, check for, like proxies or whatever, and you can obviously like then close the distances when you do finally have units and stuff like that. I don't know, like, or do we try the other way and go longer maps, and then, okay, I have to, take more opportunity to scout, and maybe like, hidden bases are more common as a strategy because, there's more of them. And so, so there's all these different things. And like also the resources with workers actually having pathing and collision instead of stacking, which we currently already have implemented, although obviously the pathfinding is still a work in progress, you could say. There is still some spinning. It's actually not as bad as I thought when you do what I was about to say, which is, as a result of that change, you kind of have to have the resource fields be further apart, right? You have to have them be sort of split up a little bit more. And I think when you have that considered, it's like, okay, well, that naturally means that because there's probably going to be less of them in the same amount of space, then oh, by the way, we removed the like requirement for the town center to be like a certain maximum distance or whatever, or minimum distance, because now the idea is more about like, where do you want to build it? Like, do you want to build it super close? Then it's harder to move units around, right? So you have to like make a qualitative assessment of that. And that's more about like, base layouts and stuff, because actually, especially for 2 out of the 3 races we're going to have, layouts are actually really important, insofar as like, one of them has something sort of like Protoss, but it's very different with how it's implemented. Like the pylon power field or whatever is like a building with an aura that is really important, or a class of building with an aura. And then the other one has something kind of like add-ons, but also very different, where you are, adding sort of things to a structure. And as a result of that, like one of them is used for your tech, and so a bunch of them are used for your production, and it's really important to make sure you leave enough space for that. So you have to like consider all of this stuff when not just making a map, but also playing the content as well. And so we leave room for the mental load of like figuring out what to do with that by slowing the game down, right? And so we can actually make the game a little bit more about the strategic aspect, and ideally we're not removing and eliminating or even minimizing or whatever the micro side of things. Like micro still matters, and like, mechanics still matter, muscle memory still matters, but you have more time to sort of explore that stage. And that's something that I think is undoubtedly informed by the fact that we have a very fast game with CMBW by comparison. So I think it's like, experimenting with a very different direction, right? It's like, where do we want to go? I don't think we're going to experiment with, re-adding supply or upgrades or anything. I feel like that's been one of the beauties of CMBW is that it has allowed us to explore things that either we've decided to revert in the long run, like the shared units that we talked about earlier in the show, or stuff that like, let's remove this and see what happens. And wow, it's just better. And like, yeah, there's some knock-on effects, but like obviously Zethar cores being super fast and having some version of adrenal glands by default and stuff. Like, yeah, okay, there's some knock-on effects you have to consider, but what do you do aside from that? Like, can you do something different? And what about a case where like you remove supply or you remove upgrades and you roll all that stuff in, and like what's the plus minus? And it's like, okay, I can adjust those imbalances or issues or rough cases, edge cases. I can adjust them in post, and then we'll fix it that way, instead of here's the system that just like artificially constrains you into doing some chores or whatever, or has some other really really negative side effect, like, oh, this unit now deals more damage, and I had no way of knowing because there was an upgrade. And it's like, what the fuck? So stuff like that, So I feel like we're in a pretty good spot of experimentation with CMBW. We can really take this to, we can really explore more options now with the information that we've gathered, and that's one of the reasons why we're going to target a little bit of a slower pacing in general, and also why I want to explore pacing more targetedly in CMBW. What can we do to make the game a little bit more slower paced without making it lame, and for lack of a better term, like without introducing some negative side effects. And if we can do stuff like that, if we can make it so that it works out a-okay, then that will be all the more information and signal data to use when judging our games that we're going to make in the future and that we are making now. So I think it all ends up, congealing, so to speak.
Yeah, it's all a learning experience. And when there's no precedent, you gotta be willing to go in and make the changes and do it yourself, because no one's gonna do it for you.
Yeah.
You gain almost nothing by looking at modern games in any context other than what not to do. And like with stuff like StarCraft 2, it's just so easy to say don't do this because it's fucking common sense. Nobody would put in these fucking macro mechanic bullshit unless they were intentionally making a chore. And if you were coming into this to intentionally make a chore, well, you weren't here to make a game to begin with. So
that's like mobile game territory, right? It's like, you do this button, push this thing, give us money.
Really, absolutely. So. It's just common sense. Nobody would do this if they were interested in making an exciting game. It's like DMC5 or, Bayonetta or whatever, with these shitty enemy designs, the QTEs, the way they change things. It's just like, we don't really want to make a difficult game. We don't want to make an interesting game. We just want chores, because chores is like you don't even need to really care. Like when it's just like you're not making a game, then who gives a shit what they want to make? It's not, we don't care anymore. So it's like you don't gain anything by going back and observing stuff and making comparisons and seeing how this or that worked, because it was all done wrong. So like it's a waste of time. So the only way to do it is to do it yourself. And that can be a very time-consuming experience. I've been fucking around with RTS stuff since 1998, and I'm still like looking at CMBW today and being like, hey, that's neat, or I would do this, or whatever. Like, There's still something I discover each and every single time I play that, because it is just a never-ending experience of learning and figuring out stuff. Like, I was thinking a couple of days ago, what would happen if you put Armageddon into this as a fourth race? Yeah. What would you do with it? How would you make it interact? Well, I probably wouldn't want the units to be revivable. So how would you interact with their corpses? And then it's like you could do all these things you couldn't do during AO's production, because it was there was no code at all, other than the attempted iScript expander and stuff like that didn't pan out. But but then it was like you would need that because you want to implement this on top of. You would never think to use Brood War when you have something like this anymore. Like, that's where we're at now. It's like, that was like back when Armageddon also was being built, I didn't want to change the races. I did make some simple changes, like removing concussive damage from vultures and ghosts.
Yep.
Changing the way nukes work, changing mind control, obviously. But, today, if I made such changes, it would just be really just game balance stuff. Like, you shouldn't be able to revive these units. Well, that's the simple one. Otherwise,
Yeah, you just make it so they don't sprawl a corpse at the end, right?
Yeah, and then you would just put it into this framework, and now you suddenly have, you've again opened the door to something completely unexplored. Like the way I would change the units, I wouldn't have random chances anymore. I'd use more distance-based stuff and have abilities that do things or whatever. It was like, and then, you know, all the concepts I had originally written out for the StarCraft 2 Armageddon Onslaught, half of those would be viable in this now. And it's like, that's just one idea, and it's, you know, each and every idea could be just silly. Maybe it will work out, but you might learn something from implementing those ideas. Yeah, so, absolutely. You know, like, I'm sure that if you came, I mean, this brings me back to all the arguments about multi-building select and shit like that. I think that if you went back 15 years ago in the heyday of the OSL and said, what happens if you remove supply? You would get a lot of pushback.
Yeah, of course.
And now, you know, I didn't really, like, it was something I hypothesized within Apex's production, but I never actually got rid of it because I wasn't at the stage where I could make huge changes to the tech tree at that point. But it was something I was like, I didn't really want to. It was a hypothesis, and it was like, do I need to do this? Do I want to do this? And it was like,
you were kind of skeptical when you first played. You were like, wait, really? You just removed it?
Yeah, and I was like, yeah, I guess I'll cross this bridge when I get there and I have more production and defenses and utility structures. And I was like, I don't want to remove it now. But then you just removed it. And I was like, okay, well, I guess we are going to cross the bridge just with this project instead, and we'll see how it worked out. And it turns out it worked out pretty damn well, I'd say.
Yeah. I think for like just allowing you to focus your, like, the reason why, and this might be a weird stretch for some people, but you'll see it pretty easily, I think, is that
Goatsy-esque.
Yeah, the Drakodons being stupid when you move them is like the same thing as supply to me. Like, we called it a chore before, right? It's like, I want you to be able to focus your attention and APM on good decision making, good strategy, and then obviously good micro movements in the battles and whatnot, or base layouts and stuff like that. I want you to be able to do things that are interesting and make interesting decisions, as opposed to, oh yeah, I've got to like select each individual building and then, you know, do my mini game where I do like F1 for the camera hotkey on my building and F2 for where my destination is, and do that for every single one. Like, that's a chore. And moving units up a ramp, it can still sometimes be a chore, but it's especially a chore with like Dragoons and Brood War. And then, you know, yeah, I mean, the first supply depot and the second supply depot to a lesser extent actually have some significant impact. And then after that, it's just a fucking chore, dude. It's like, I don't care about this at all. It's so boring. I can't believe I have to do this, you know, and having to deal with that is like, I don't know why nobody's really experimented with removing it, or if they have, maybe it's just missed me, or maybe it's been like replaced with some other chore, you know, like, no, just remove it and then like see what happens as a result. And yes, it did accelerate the early game. Yes, it frees up more resources and workers and etc. for, you know, other things, or like for Zerg, it frees up more larvae for other things. So yes, you do see more workers and more military units in the early stages of the game, and there is an acceleration there. And yes, we should continue to, you know, manage that to whatever degree is necessary for a healthy game state as we see it. But that doesn't mean that, yeah, just add it back, bro. Like, that doesn't mean that it was like, I definitely think that, you know, the removal of supply, it's like a more obvious version of the removal of upgrades. It's like, it's a very significant change in favor of consistency and this feeling that you flow between your, you know, movements and decisions and stuff. And I feel like it definitely ended up working out.
Yeah, what I tried to do, like, especially with upgrades, is I looked at upgrades and I was like, what do you lose by removing them? And the answer to that question was, well, you lose some decision making about when to invest in an upgrade, you know, the much more in-depth tech progression that was happening at that point. And I was like, well, why not just push that into building construction? And then with supply, it would be basically the same thing. It was like, why would you be up against removing supply? And my answer would have been, well, I wanted way more SimCitying and base and macro focus in Apex. I wanted big, huge bases, lots of emphasis on this. And then that's why defenses were stronger in general, because actually defending this was supposed to be a lot more difficult because it was going to be larger. And then, like, the answers for that would be to make more interesting buildings. Supply buildings aren't interesting. They don't do anything. They're not really interactive. I mean, if you lose them, it's bad, but, you know, they don't really contribute. And I was already heading towards that by having late late game structures that, obviously artillery and SDI defenses, but also the resource injection structures were all built into the economic model. And that was all part of the SimCity thing. And I think I would just go that route with having other utility structures that, maybe, like I was hypothesizing a power related system. Power is almost like supply, but I would have it probably more interactive, like with pylons. Like pylons still serve an interactive purpose.
Yes.
Even when you don't have supply on them, then you just emphasize their utility as, being a part of the supplying power to structures. I could do something like that. Like that's still a lot better than just having, you have a supply to post, so now this invisible number goes up. So it's just like when I like that's with Apex X, I obviously, as I mentioned many times, I come into challenges like that where like the moveset stands to change a lot. The last thing I was working on was the stagger system and implementing tiers to the stagger system for the mobs and all these other things is because I tried an idea, and if it doesn't work, I tried alterations to that idea. And then I ask myself, why does this not feel right? What could I do to make this feel more right? So the stagger system underwent a lot of really major changes. And now it's just completely unlike the original in the first voyage. And I also ended up finding a bug on the player that I also fixed in the process, which your stagger health could go into the negatives. And it explains some of the regeneration inconsistencies I would see, particularly when dealing with the clouds, which it wasn't very common, so it wasn't exposed a lot, but I was noticing it was taking a longer time to regenerate than it should have, despite changes I was making. And I was like, there is a bug here, but what the fuck is it? Well, it turns out I'm retarded. So, and then there was like, I had this pushback where it was like, I didn't like that some very fast enemies could hit you and deal full damage to you. I had transformable damage, but I didn't want them to deal transformable damage. And I was recently watching one of my Dark Souls 3 randomizer run videos, and it reminded me of something I was thinking of a long time ago, which was implementing bleed damage, which was something that you had to stack to deal damage. And I don't have any of this stuff implemented, but I was thinking of implementing the float damage I mentioned before, the bleed damage, and then a bleed stagger damage. And it was just like, I didn't really want to fundamentally change the way health works. I didn't want to add chip health. I didn't want to add a regenerating shield like in Halo or any of this other stuff like this. But I was looking at adding enemies with a lot of very fast repeating attacks. And I wanted the interaction to be less binary with these enemies in particular. None of the ones that are currently in the project, but ones that are on the design table. Or I wanted you to have to consider their threat differently without changing the fundamentals of the way the system works. So maybe I will add in something like bleed damage and try it out. Maybe not. Maybe they'll do something very distinct where one of the demons was going to have two swords, and each of her swords was going to have a color type associated with it, and you had to get hit with both color types to actually take a point of damage from it. So that's another idea. So, I don't know if these ideas are good or how they're going to play, and I won't know until I actually implement them. The only way to know is to actually implement them. And that's the only way to guess. And in industrial gaming, it's all play it by the market. You have your marketers leading your game development. Yeah. And one of the biggest issues, and one of the reasons why, all game developers start out somewhere. They were all incompetent Neanderthals at some point in their lives. Some of them learned from that and grew from it. Most of them don't, because they're too scared to. They're too scared to take risks. They're too scared to do something different. And so that's why you have all this cargo cult shit where it's like, especially with World of Warcraft and everything Blizzard's done is, hey, they were successful. If we copy their recipe to success, then we too will be successful. Why was there never a WoW killer? Because nobody understood why WoW was successful. They saw it was successful. They copy pasted it based on YouTube videos that didn't actually play it. They didn't try to understand it. Very obvious with Final Fantasy XIV is they did not try to understand what made World of Warcraft successful. And to this day, they still have made no actual effort to improve the fundamentals of that game. They've actually made it worse and worse and worse. They were in the prime opportunity to finally dethrone World of Warcraft. They have very, very successfully thrown that away. And they threw away all the advantages they did have in the first 1.0 edition of their product, which had a lot of interesting ideas in it. But they threw all that away when they wanted to hardline into YouTube videos of World of Warcraft because they were too scared. Their project was failing, and they hard doubled down on copy pasting something they very obviously didn't understand. And that's the problem with RTS, is Warcraft 3 was successful, and Warcraft 3 had heroes, so you gotta have heroes in your RTS. And look where that has taken us. Where StarCraft 2 is considered a great game just because it doesn't have heroes and multiplayer. That's exclusively the why. It's the same reason that people think Dark Souls is a hard game, so it's good.
Yeah.
Is so few games are willing to actually kill the player. So Dark Souls killed the player, so it must be good. And like the inverse of the interaction is just as bad as the interaction itself, where nobody opens their eyes and applies common sense. Nobody is actually willing to go out and try out these ideas because they break the norm. And breaking the norm is bad. It gives you downvotes, and downvotes so death in real life.
Yeah, the number of I don't even know what you would call it, but it's definitely related to cargo culting. It's just like lazy thinking has definitely, it's been the downfall and the stasis, I guess, of many genres, many works, like many mediums, and certainly many franchises down the years, where you think about, like I was thinking about this earlier, and how, like, obviously I don't really rate Halo as a franchise or even as, like, the individual games, but they did have things that were very specific to Halo. I mean, corridor shooters are kind of generic, I guess, but like the fact that they had the regenerating shields and stuff, the fact that they had like the different enemy types that were so different, and all the different weapons and stuff that were so different from each other, that like actually in the single player experience, you were dealing with a very different experience for the campaigns. Then, they had the vehicle sections, and they had all these like set pieces and stuff. And I don't necessarily think that it was the most interesting experience, but like there's things about it that were very much removed from other genres or other games within the FPS genre or whatever. And then Halo 4 comes out, and especially Halo 5 comes out, and it's just like, what if we put Call of Duty stuff into Halo? And
I
what
didn't
if we
even know
forced
Halo
everybody
5 even existed.
Yeah.
Like, that's just how off the radar it is, because they all just blend together. You just think back to that meme image of all the logos and all the walking soldiers, the bands of colors from all the different games just blended together. They're all the same fucking thing, because they are. Yeah. They're all the same thing.
Yeah.
Like look at Fortnite. Fortnite originated as, building and constructing, and I guess it was team versus team or whatever. I never played it. But then the whole fucking Battle Royale craze happens. They implemented Battle Royale, and then that became the thing, and they basically abandoned the rest of it. And the Battle Royale has been such a disaster for shooters that were already doing so badly because of Call of Duty. Because Call of Duty basically destroyed the whole fucking thing. And now every single shooter people just expect to have perks and gunships and nukes and achievements and unlockables. And it's just like, how could you ever get this genre off the ground when this is what people are actually expecting? Is so gross. Hopefully Counter-Strike 2 turns out to be not a heaping pile of shit, and hopefully they don't do stupid shit like that. But, given what they did with Team Fortress 2, I don't have any hopes for it at all. And I mean, not even Team Fortress 2. Given what they did with Counter-Strike Go in the skins and that, I don't have any hopes for it.
Well, they added in all of these agent skins on top of it, which just makes everything look like a cartoony fucking Fortnite experience again. They've slowly but surely moved away from it wasn't even gritty or realistic. It was just like understated or whatever. It was like simple, I guess, the lighting configurations and the way that the game looked aesthetically or whatever. Yeah, they also have a lot of stupid defaults. Like, there's like some weird default matte you can disable for like 10 extra FPS, by the way. Yeah. All this other shit that like people have figured out for optimization purposes, because obviously as a competitive game, people care a lot about their FPS and stuff. So like their frames, that is. So yeah, like, I don't know. There's a lot of really big issues. Like, there's in Counter-Strike, like basically an equivalent issue to like the ramps in Brood War being fucked forever and still fucked now in terms of not just visuals but like game rules where like you'll be at the top of the ramp and you'll get a height advantage even like you're at the very very bottom of the ramp, I should say. The base of the ramp will be like because it's the north ramp, you'll be to the above the high ground, but still on the low ground allegedly. Except you'll have the height advantage, and your enemies will be on the high part of the ramp, but they'll actually have a height disadvantage. So you'll just randomly miss shit. And professional games and probably careers have been decided because of that, and that's just disgusting. Yeah. Now in Counter-Strike, there are similar things that you might as well just call bugs, especially like related to smoke grenades, where sometimes if you put a Molotov behind the smoke grenade, you will see through the smoke grenade. So you just see it. You just see you basically see the fire, and if anybody's standing in the smoke, you'll just be able to tell, right? For a good while before they patched it, they still haven't fixed that, by the way. For a while, they had a bug where you could stand in a smoke, and then as it was fading, your radar would update before your screen. And so you would instantly see where somebody was, and pros would just adjust their aim and kill them, and then walk away, right? Because the smoke is still fading. And then, that was silly. But then there's also all the really stupid things they've done with the meta. They've made the economy more forgiving. They've made it so that for a long time we were in a meta where people were literally just spamming people through smokes and wallbangs instead of actually taking fights. And I was like, wow, this is really skillful gameplay. Like technically there's skills for like triangulating where the enemy might be and like muscle memory and stuff, but you're just watching people shoot through walls and shit instead of actually shooting each other. So like that's stupid. So and it's like what we've seen in CMBW where like if maybe the best way to play, theoretically, I don't actually think this is the case, but if the best way to play is building ion cannons, then like pros would just do that all the time, right? And that would be a problem for the game's health, I would say. But then if, in CS, it's like, oh yeah, everybody's building or buying a specific gun and shooting through smokes because the tracers don't exist for silenced weapons. And like, here's all this other stuff that makes it so that you can do this. And we just saw a really boring meta basically develop where also like it wasn't even really the most conventionally skilled players who were finding success either, which was another part of it. So that was pretty lame. And, the fact that they're so absentee means that they'll make a change. It'll probably be dumb because they're not really grounded in the game, and then they'll take like 6 months to a year to fix it. So, yeah, I'm not a crazy Valve backer as far as CS2 or whatever it's going to be called is concerned. Maybe it'll be good enough that it won't be a terrible game because they're going to try to prevent market cannibalization, as the saying goes. For every developer does, right? It's like. They when people were still staying away from Source because they wanted to play on 1.6, they were like, what the fuck? You can't do that. I don't think they actually did anything because they're Valve. They don't really do much of anything. But, like, obviously we all know the tales of Brood War being, esports being shunned and canned by Blizzard because of StarCraft 2 coming out. They were worried that it wouldn't compete. So...
Well, it turns out it didn't compete.
Yeah. Brood War is still more popular as an esport than StarCraft.
Yeah.
That's so mental to me.
It's very much expected. Like, it's you can't just kill Brood War because Blizzard wasn't responsible for Brood War existing to begin with. Like, they made the game, but the esports scene was its own thing, right? Yeah. So you can't, like, you can pull out the rug from Kespa and the main roots of it, but that doesn't change the fact that the people are still playing it, and they're going to continue to just still play it. And yeah, like it just shows a complete lack of connection that Blizzard had, and complete lack of care. And it was also really just an admission that the new StarCraft 2 was going to be a complete failure, but they had to force it out as it was anyways because
well, it's a marketing driven. It's a marketing driven decision because nobody who is actually a creative person who had pride in their work and thought that they made a good thing, like you're saying, right? They wouldn't think, I better make sure that nobody can play the other version of the thing. Like, they think, okay, this is the better version. This is the sequel. It's supposed to be better. Here's maybe worst comes to worst. Here's a product that has parallel, player base and stuff. And like people can play the old one or they can play this new one. And that's fine because they're both still playing my game and giving me money to buy it or whatever. Like I don't even understand why they were so hell bent on replacing it. I guess because Kespa had too much control over Brood War or something maybe, but it seems like a silly decision to make because either way, dude, they're playing your game. It's not like it's a competitor's game. Obviously then you wouldn't have any authority to do the stupid fucking exercise to begin with, but I find it so short-sighted one-sided. It's like if we release our first game and then people still like to play CMBW sometimes, I don't think that's going to be a fucking affront. Like, it's not like even a referendum on our game because our first game is going to be different. Like I was just talking about the pacing, right? It's like our first game is going to be different, and then our next game is going to be different. And, you know, whatever lessons we learned, we hope, like we definitely suspect that our first game is going to be a higher quality experience than CMBW, but it's also going to be a meaningfully distinct experience. So, yeah, you might scratch an itch, but by playing CMBW specifically, even though this game is, you know, better in many other ways, right? It's also different in many ways, and so that difference is enough. Like, I just don't understand the idea, though. You have to make sure that, no, all right, we're going to pull updates, and yeah, we're deleting the repositories, guys. You can never play CMBW again because play our new game. Give us money. Like, no, what the fuck? That's so silly. That doesn't even make sense to me. But I'm also not a marketer, so.
Yeah, it's just newer is better always. That's just the way it is. Newer is flashier.
Yeah,
and companies are willing to cannibalize their old player bases and their old titles to just try to force out just a few more sales. Yeah. There's no loyalty to people or products in a developer. It's just the bottom line is just make the money. Don't get sued by your shareholders because you made less money than the last product.
Yeah.
You know, that
never-ending expanse. Yeah, that's one of the reasons why, you know, assuming we do get the money from Indie Fund, it's really nice because it's pretty much no strings attached. We do have to pay back the money that they gave us twice over, but it's like we don't want any creative input. Like, make your game, right? Like, we're backing you because we believe in you, kind of deal. So that seems like a lot better. Every other place I've researched is like, maybe they say that, but I'm not sure that they're as straightforward with it or whatever. You know, they don't say it in as plain language, and most of them don't say that anyway. They're like, we want some assurances and blah, blah, blah. Like, no, just let me do the work, right? So that's the kind of deal. But yeah, so I do think we're sort of coming to the end of this discussion, talking about pacing, talking about ways to do it without ways to improve it and fix it without breaking other things. And it's definitely, I've come away with it giving, you know, more thought to some ideas. Like, some obvious ones would be like, maybe I kind of want to avoid just inflating HP a lot of the times, but obviously that's been successful for Mavericks, not inflating their HP directly, but reducing the damage they take from stim. That's been successful for Spider Mines, where obviously the time to kill was reduced because units actually followed orders, like in default StarCraft. And, you know, but, you know, maybe, and I guess even it's been successful for the workers, actually, because the non-Mason workers, the Droleth and the Scribe, got +5 HP. So maybe I could do that again because workers are still very fragile, and maybe that would help. But honestly, I'm not really sure what I'm not really sure what a good solution necessarily looks like, right, is the main thing. So, well, I'll have to.
The only way to find out is by sticking your dick into the outlet.
That's usually how I solve my problems. And for some reason, I have both a healthcare and electric bill. I don't know what's up with that. Yeah, so I guess that's pretty much it. I don't know if you had any final thoughts or words to leave us with.
Not really. No,
that's it.
It's just, I think I said most of what I intended to say.
There you go. Well, thank you for sticking with us through the interruptions then, because obviously you had to deal with some shit.
It's madness every day, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're only 2 episodes away from the coveted 69. Well, I guess 1 episode away, because after that, the second episode, you get the idea. So we'll be back, and hopefully before you have to vacate the premises. So.
Yeah, that's going to be, I don't know if we'll be able to record again. So
right. At least get to that fabled number, and then we'll see what happens after.
Yeah.
All right, man. Cheers and GG.
Well, smoke weed every day.